Picture a single soldier at the very end of a long day's march. The sun is going down somewhere over hostile country, country that cannot feed him, and he is carrying something close to 60 pounds on one man's back. Modern estimates put the marching load in that range, and the ancient writers agree it was brutal enough that soldiers complained about it for 4 straight centuries. On his shoulders and slung from a forked carrying pole are the stakes for the night's fortifications, the digging tools, the cooking pot, the mess kit, a few days of rations, and, tucked in among all that iron, a small round hand mill made of 2 stones. A personal grain mill. He has hauled it all day, in the sun, in the dust, and he has not put it down once. Here is the thing you are supposed to feel before we go anywhere. This man is not about to lie down. Before he sleeps, he is going to help dig a ditch, throw up an earth rampart, and drive a wall of sharpened stakes into the top of it, turning empty ground into a fortress in a couple of hours. Then he is going to take that hand mill, grind his own flour, and bake his own bread over a fire in a trench he cut himself. He does all of this at the end of a march. He does it again tomorrow, and the sword on his hip, the famous short blade that every documentary loves to linger on, is the least interesting thing he is carrying. So here is the question this whole video exists to answer. How did Rome feed an army that size, that far from home, for centuries, when almost every other power in the ancient world could not keep a host fed for a single hard season? And why was that, and not the fighting, the thing that no rival ever managed to copy? Because an army does not march on courage, it marches on grain. Every empire before Rome, and most of the ones that came after it, broke on the exact same problem. You can raise a host. You can arm it and inspire it and point it at the enemy. But you cannot keep it fed once it starts to move, and a host that cannot be fed does not lose battles. It dissolves before them. It bleeds away in desertion. It mutinies over an empty stomach, and it dies of dysentery in a filthy camp long before it ever dies on the point of a spear. Rome's real weapon was never the gladius. It was the answer to a question its enemies never even learned to ask properly. What does this man eat tomorrow, and who has already made certain of it? That is the whole arc of what you are about to watch. The pack he carries, the ration he actually eats, the way he turns raw grain into a meal out of almost nothing, the roads and rivers and grain fleets that put the food in front of him in the first place. And then the part that almost nobody tells you, the dark side of the same story. What happened again and again when that machine broke down and the invincible legion starved in the field, like any other army that ever ran out of bread. Before we build the machine, one promise about how this is going to be told, because it matters more here than almost anywhere. This is not a sword and sandals fantasy dressed up as history. It is the record, and for once, the record is unusually good. We have the military manuals. Vegetius wrote a handbook on the drilled routine of the army, on how a soldier was fed and trained and marched. Polybius, a Greek historian who watched Rome up close in its rising years, left us a careful, almost anthropological description of how a legion built its camp and ordered its marching column. We have the archaeology, the outlines of marching camps scratched into the ground from Scotland to the Middle East, the worn quernstones, the field ovens cut into the backs of rampart walls. We have, from the fort of Vindolanda, just south of Hadrian's Wall, hundreds of thin wooden writing tablets, actual quartermaster's paperwork from around the year 100, that list the food and the beer and the day-to-day supplies moving through one frontier garrison. And we have the modern logistics historians, above all, Jonathan Roth, who sat down and did the arithmetic that the Romans never bothered to write out. How many tons of food an army of a given size actually swallowed in a single day. Where those sources agree, I will tell you plainly. Where they do not, I will say so out loud. The exact ration shifted with the century, the province, and what a given campaign could physically get its hands on. And honest history admits that instead of inventing one tidy number and calling it a law, when the record is thin, you are going to hear me say the record is thin. Keep that in mind because it is the entire reason you can trust the parts where the record is loud. Let us start with a pack and with that strange little mill. The problem here is older than Rome, and it is the one that quietly killed most ancient armies. Feeding a large force on the move is not a matter of simply having enough food somewhere in the world. It is a matter of getting the food to one specific man on the one day he needs it, and then doing that again the next day and the next, while he is walking steadily away from wherever the food happens to be. A city can be provisioned. It sits still and the grain comes to it. A moving army is a city that packs itself up and relocates every single afternoon into land that resents it and would rather it starved. The Greek and Hellenistic armies that Rome grew up fighting leaned heavily on enormous baggage trains, on crowds of hired camp followers, on foraging as they went, and on the simple hope that the countryside ahead would cooperate. When it did not, and it often did not, those armies came apart at the seams. Rome's answer was to shove the supply problem downward, onto the body of the individual soldier. The legionary carried, on his own back, several days of grain, and the tool that turned it into food. The soldiers were nicknamed, only half in jest, the mules of Marius, after the general Gaius Marius, who is remembered for driving the reforms that made the men carry their own kit rather than trailing a bloated wagon column behind them. That is why they marched under such a punishing load. And the load was heavy on purpose, because a smaller baggage train meant a faster army, a shorter and less vulnerable supply tail, and fewer wagons to guard and fewer wagons to lose. The mill is the detail that shows you how serious they were about it. The grain was carried as whole grain, not as flour. And that choice was deliberate, because whole grain keeps for a long time and flour goes stale and spoils fast. Carrying grain instead of flour meant every unit needed its own way to grind it fresh, on the spot, whenever it was needed. So look at how the army was actually built from the bottom up. The smallest building block of the legion was a group of 8 men who shared a leather tent, a pack mule, and a common mess. The Romans called it a contubernium, which just means the men who tent together. 10 of those 8-man messes made up a century, and it was the century and the mess inside it that lived and cooked and ground grain as a unit. Those 8 men shared a rotary quern, 2 heavy stones you turn by hand against each other, and every man in the mess took his turn leaning on the handle. Think hard about what that arrangement actually does. It means the army is not one gigantic single mouth waiting at the end of one fragile pipe. It is thousands of small, self-contained feeding units, each one carrying its own days of fuel and its own kitchen on 8 pairs of shoulders and 1 mule. You cannot starve that army by cutting one wagon road because there is no single wagon road holding it up. Every man is in a small but genuine way a piece of his own supply line. That is the first component of the machine. And notice that it is already doing something the sword could never do. It is making the army difficult to break by turning hunger from one catastrophic point of failure into a problem spread thin across the whole force. If you have ever wondered what it actually takes to feed a human being from raw grain and open fire, with no kitchen, no store, and nothing but a couple of stones and a flame, this next stretch is exactly that. And it is where I want to point you at something before we go on. We put together a collection of these old from scratch, no modern comfort skills, turning raw grain into a day's bread with a hand mill and a fire, the practical, hands in the dirt kind of knowing that a Roman soldier lived by every day and that almost all of us have completely lost. It is not a sales pitch. It is simply a place where that knowledge is kept together in one spot instead of scattered and forgotten. The link is down in the description if you want it. Now, let us talk about what was actually in the ration, because this is where the myths pile up thickest. The foundation, the thing that everything else in the diet sat on top of, was grain. Wheat, above all others. Depending on how you read the figure Polybius gives, an infantryman's monthly grain allowance works out to somewhere near 2 pounds of wheat a day. And the calorie arithmetic that Roth and other historians have run points the same way. Grain supplied the clear majority of a soldier's daily energy, plausibly somewhere in the neighborhood of 2/3 of it. I want to be honest with you that these are reconstructions built on a small handful of surviving ancient measures and a large amount of careful inference, not a number stamped on a Roman ledger somewhere. But the shape of the answer is not in any doubt at all. This was a diet built on wheat, and it was built for endurance rather than for pleasure. That wheat reached the soldier's stomach in 3 main forms, and a given man ate all 3, depending on what the day allowed. The first was proper bread, flour ground fresh, mixed and baked into loaves whenever the army had the time and the oven standing.
Before we continue, I want to show you something amazing. We put together a simple guide for the people who really care about these stories. Because whether we're talking about old school food, forgotten trade, one truth remains the same. History is disappearing. This is for anyone who believes these memories, these lessons, these ways of life are still worth keeping. You can find it in the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code right here.
The second was porridge, the oldest soldier's meal there is. Grain and pulses boiled together in a pot into a thick mush that filled a belly fast with almost no equipment at all. And the third, the one that truly mattered on the move, was hardtack, a twice-baked biscuit the Romans called buccellatum, cooked until it was bone dry so that it would keep for weeks in a pack without rotting. It was hard as a roof tile and about as kind to the teeth. But it traveled, and a man could gnaw it cold on a forced march when there was no chance to light a fire. That biscuit is the direct ancestor of every piece of military hardtack that came after it, straight down the centuries to the ship's biscuit that crossed oceans 1,500 years later. There is one more thing worth knowing about the grain, because it tells you how central it was. Wheat was the normal ration, the good ration, the one a soldier expected. Barley was the punishment. When a unit disgraced itself, one of the recorded penalties was to have its grain ration switched from wheat to barley, the coarser grain that Romans associated with animals and with the lowest tables. You do not punish men by fiddling with a side dish. You punish them by touching the thing at the center of their day. The grain was the center of the day. Around that core sat the rest of the ration, and it was more varied than the porridge cliché suggests. There was sour wine, and more commonly posca, cheap wine that had turned acidic, cut with water into a tart, vinegary drink that was far safer than the local water and carried a bit of a bite and a little nourishment with it. There was olive oil, the fat of the whole ancient Mediterranean world, poured over bread and stirred into the pot. There was salt, which the army needed in real quantity, both for the men and for preserving meat. There was hard cheese, and there was bacon and rendered fat, all of which kept and traveled well. And there was fish sauce, the pungent salty garum that the Romans splashed onto almost everything, a rare hit of strong flavor in a diet that was otherwise pretty grim. And there was meat, a good deal of it. It is also worth being honest that not everyone at the fort ate the same. The Vindolanda tablets that survive from the commander's household read almost like a different world from the ranker's mess. Oysters, spices, fine wine, roe deer, the food of officers who could afford it and had the servants to prepare it. The ordinary soldier ate grain and pork and posca. The man giving him orders ate rather better. That gap ran all the way up and down the army, and it is the sort of small human fact that the heroic version tends to sand off. Here I want to knock down a story you have almost certainly heard, because it gets repeated constantly, and it is mostly wrong. The picture of the near-vegetarian legionary, the lean, disciplined Roman living monkishly on wheat porridge and looking down his nose at meat as a barbarian indulgence, simply does not survive contact with the evidence. The Vindolanda tablets, and even more, the sheer mass of animal bone dug out of Roman military sites, tell a completely different story. Pork, beef, mutton, poultry, venison, all of it, moving through the forts and cook pits in serious quantity. Meat was not the base of the diet. Grain was. But the soldier ate a great deal more meat than the cliché allows, and it plainly mattered to morale as much as to calories. When you total the day up, the ration was heavy, monotonous, and enormously caloric, an intake that modern reconstructions frequently place well north of 3,000 calories, because this was fuel for a man walking 20 miles under 60 pounds of kit, and then digging a fort at the end of it. The whole thing was designed around a single stubborn goal: keep this body working. Tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The point underneath the menu is the same as the point underneath the mill. This ration was chosen because it was durable, portable, and dependable. Those are the qualities that keep an army standing in the field when a richer, softer diet would have spoiled in a week and left the men sick. None of it was about taste. It was about not running out, day after day, for as long as the war lasted. Now let me give you the number that makes the whole problem real, because this is where those logistics historians earn their keep. Take a mid-sized field army, say something in the range of 40,000 men, which was not an unusual size for a serious campaign. Run the grain ration and the calorie math across that many bodies, and you land on a figure that Roth and others have worked out carefully, and it is staggering. That army needed something on the order of dozens of tons of grain every single day, just to keep the men on their feet. Not once, not for a supply drop. Every day, for as long as the campaign lasted, arriving on schedule, hundreds of miles from the nearest home field. Miss a few days of that, and the men get hungry. Miss a couple of weeks, and you no longer have an army. You have a disaster looking for somewhere to happen. Once you have really sat with that number, the roads and the barges and the granaries stop looking like background scenery and start looking like the actual main event. And here is the part that most people never think about at all: the piece hiding underneath even the grain. The men were not the biggest eaters in a Roman army. The animals were. Every marching column dragged along mules and oxen and cavalry horses, and those animals had to eat too, and an animal eats far more by weight than a man does. Worse, the thing they mostly ate, fresh fodder and grazing, is bulky, heavy, and close to impossible to haul any real distance, because the cart carrying the fodder needs animals to pull it, and those animals eat the fodder. That single ugly fact shaped the entire rhythm of ancient warfare. It is a large part of why campaigns ran in a season, why armies moved when the grass was growing and the crops were standing in the enemy's fields, and why a general timed his march to the calendar of the harvest as carefully as to the movements of the enemy. The soldier could carry his grain, but nobody could carry a horse's summer. The countryside itself had to provide it, which meant the countryside partly decided when Rome could fight at all. So the man has his grain, his oil, his sour wine, his salt, and cheese and meat. Now watch him actually make dinner, because this is the part that the battle footage never once shows you, and it is honestly the most quietly astonishing part of the entire story. The problem is stark when you lay it out. You have to feed tens of thousands of men, every single night, with no permanent kitchen anywhere, no ovens waiting for you at the end of the march, and no guarantee whatsoever that you will still be in this same spot come tomorrow evening. The Roman answer was to fold cooking directly into the daily military routine. It was done in the dirt, done fast, and done by the same 8 men who slept and fought together. It began at the quern. In the evening, the grain got ground down by hand into a coarse flour, each mess taking its turn, the stones rasping and grinding away in their thousands across the whole camp until the sound must have been a low roar. Then came the fire and the bread. Often the men baked simple flat loaves straight in the ashes and embers of a cooking fire, the dough laid onto a hot stone or buried in hot ash and dug back out, blackened when it was done. Where the army had the time, and especially in the semi-permanent camps and the frontier forts, it built proper field ovens, dome-shaped ovens of clay and turf. And you can still find the remains of them today, cut into the back of camp ramparts, tucked right against the earthwork so that the defensive wall did double duty as the wall of the oven. And for the road ahead, the men baked buccellatum, running the biscuit through the oven twice so that it dried out completely and would survive weeks in the bottom of a pack. And notice who was doing it. It was the mess, the same 8 men every night. That was not an accident either. The men who ground the grain together, cooked in one pot together, and ate off the same fire were the men who stood shoulder to shoulder in the line the next day. The Romans built the smallest unit of the army around a meal on purpose, because eating together is how you turn 8 strangers into a unit that will not run when the shields lock. The cook fire was a discipline machine as much as it was a kitchen, and you can hear the ordinary texture of it in the Vindolanda tablets, where the paperwork is not about heroism at all but about pork fat and grain and beer. One officer writing about supplies running low, requests going up the chain for more, the small, anxious arithmetic of keeping a garrison fed on a cold frontier. That is the real daily life of the army, and it lived at the mess fire. Grind, bake, dry, carry. That was the daily rhythm, and it repeated on a scale that is genuinely difficult to hold in your head. An entire moving city, tens of thousands strong, grinding its own flour and baking its own bread every single night out of the raw grain that each man had carried on his own back, and then rising in the dark and doing the whole thing over again the next day. When the army was standing still long enough, it foraged, and it requisitioned from the surrounding country and from allied towns, taking grain and animals on the hoof to stretch what the men carried. But the core skill, the thing that made all of it possible, sat in the hands of the individual soldier at his mess fire. None of it required permanence, and that was the deep genius of the arrangement. The kitchen was simply wherever the army stopped walking, because the kitchen was the men, the stones, and the fire they carried with them. That handles a soldier feeding himself for a few days. But no amount of grain in a man's pack gets an army through a long campaign or a siege that drags on for months. A soldier can carry a couple of weeks of food. He cannot carry a year of it. So behind the individual man stood the second half of the machine, the enormous and almost invisible half, the part that gathered up a whole continent's harvest and moved it to wherever the army happened to be standing, and this is where the scale of the thing becomes almost hard to believe. Start with the roads. We tend to think of Roman roads as monuments, as straight paved lines cutting arrogantly across the map for the sheer glory of engineering. They were arteries. At the height of the empire, the network of major paved highways ran to more than 50,000 miles, and the wider road system to several times that. And it was built quite as much to move supply and messages as to move marching men. A hard, well-drained, all-weather road means a supply wagon that does not bog down to its axles in the November mud, and a courier who can reach the frontier in a matter of days, rather than vanishing into a swamp. The roads were logistics wearing the costume of engineering. Then there was water, because water beat the road every single time it possibly could. Moving grain overland by ox cart was punishingly slow and shockingly expensive, and the oxen ate up a share of the very load they were dragging as they went. Moving that same grain by river barge or by ship was cheaper by an enormous margin. The price gap was so large that a later Roman price list, the edict issued under the Emperor Diocletian, shows sea transport running at a tiny fraction of the cost of hauling the same goods the same distance by land. So the Romans leaned on their rivers as if they were highways. The Rhine, the Rhone, the Danube, all of them carried grain and oil and wine downstream on barges to the frontier armies camped along their banks. And behind the rivers stood the great grain provinces, the bread baskets, Egypt and North Africa above all, whose harvests were shipped out in bulk by fleets of dedicated grain ships. Most of that particular flood of grain fed the vast population of the city of Rome itself, through the state supply that the Romans called the annona. But the same logic, the same web of ports and fleets and warehouses kept the armies eating too. And wherever the food came ashore or came off the road, the Romans built to hold it. Depots and granaries, the horia, purpose-built storehouses raised up off the ground on little pillars or low sleeper walls so that air could move under the floor and keep the grain from rotting or catching damp. They positioned these along the supply routes and inside every permanent fort. That is exactly what turns a campaign from a gamble into a system. A general with a chain of full granaries stretching back behind him is not standing there hoping the local countryside decides to cooperate. He is drawing down a reserve that reaches road by road and river by river and warehouse by warehouse, all the way back to the wheat fields of an entire continent. The Romans also thought in terms of forward bases, and this is a piece of the design worth pausing on, because it is so modern it feels out of place in the ancient world. Before a major campaign pushed into new territory, grain was gathered and stockpiled in advance at a base close to the frontier, so that the army stepped off not with only what it could carry, but with a filled reserve sitting right behind it, ready to be moved forward as the men advanced. Some of that grain came from the annona and the fleets. A great deal of it was simply demanded from the provinces and the allied communities the army passed through, requisitioned as a tax paid in wheat, or bought, or, when it came to it, taken. A Roman army on the march was a moving mouth that the whole surrounding region was expected to feed, and Rome had the administration to make that demand stick, to assess a district, name a quota, and collect it. The fighting was the part the enemy saw. The paperwork, the assessment, the granary, the barge, the depot, inching forward behind the column. That was the part that actually decided how long Rome could keep a war going, and it was the part no rival ever built to match. And then, every single night out on campaign, all of this, the men and the mules and the grain and the tools, was wrapped up and protected by one habit that sums up the whole Roman way of war, better than any battle ever could: the marching camp. When a Roman army halted for the night in the field, it did not simply make camp the way you or I picture making camp. It built a fort. Polybius describes the drill in real detail, and the archaeology confirms it right across Europe. The same rectangular plan, surveyed and pegged out fresh every single evening. A ditch dug all the way around, the spoil thrown up into an earth rampart, a palisade of the sharpened stakes each man had carried driven in along the top. And inside, the tents pitched in the same fixed grid every night, the same streets, the same gates, so that every soldier in the army knew in the dark exactly where his own unit slept and exactly where the commander's tent stood. An army that had marched all day under full load sat down and built defensive engineering from scratch, and then at dawn tore it back down and marched off to do the identical thing again that night. People usually explain the marching camp purely as a defensive measure, and of course it was that. But look hard at what it was really wrapped around. Inside that rampart were the sleeping men, yes, but also the pack mules, the baggage, the grain reserve, the tools, and the soldiers who ground and hauled and cooked all of it. The camp was armor built fresh every night around the supply. It was the daily, physical, sweat and shovel proof that this was a system and not a mob. A force disciplined enough to fortify its own dinner every single night in enemy country, exhausted, in the dark, with the stakes it had carried on its own shoulders. The camp tells you everything you need to know. This army treated its food and its stores as the thing most worth digging a fortress around, because it understood, in a way its enemies simply did not, that if the food failed, everything else they were carrying failed with it. Which brings us to the thing this whole video has been quietly walking toward from the first frame. None of what made Rome win was the courage you could actually see on a battlefield. That is the part the statues sell you, the heroic clash and the eagle standard and the wall of shields. And it is real, all of it. But it is only the visible surface. Underneath it, an army that grinds its own grain, builds its own fort every night, and sits at the end of a supply line reaching all the way back to the grain fields of a continent, is an army that can, above everything else, simply stay. It can stay in the field when its enemies have to break off and go home to bring in the harvest and feed their own families. It can sit down outside a walled city and outlast every soul inside it, because the besieging army is being fed by a fleet while the besieged are living on whatever happened to be in the cellars on the day the gates swung shut. You can watch the whole logic play out in a single famous siege. When Julius Caesar cornered the Gaulish leader Vercingetorix in the hill fort of Alesia, Caesar did not simply attack. He built. He ringed the entire fort with miles of fortification to starve the defenders in. And then, when a massive Gaulish relief army came marching to break the siege, he built a second ring of fortifications facing outward to hold the relief force off. His own army was now besieged in turn, caught between the two. And read his own account of that whole Gallic war, and you find that the thing he comes back to again and again, the thing that clearly kept him awake at night, is not glory and not the enemy's numbers. It is the grain supply. Over and over, the campaign turns not on who was braver, but on who could keep eating. Alesia fell because the men inside ran out of food before the men outside did. That, and not a single charge, is what actually decided it. There is a quieter version of the same danger that never made it into the stories, and it explains why the supply line mattered even when nobody had cut it. An army that stays too long in one place eats the surrounding country bare. Foraging works for a while, but a force of tens of thousands strips the fields and empties the barns for miles around within weeks. And once the local food is gone, the army has to either move on or be fed from somewhere else. That is the real reason a besieging force needed a supply chain of its own. Sitting still, doing nothing, an army was quietly starving the ground under its own feet. And if the wagons and barges did not keep coming, the besieger could go hungry faster than the besieged. So standing still was never actually the safe option, it looks like. The ground was emptying under the army the whole time, and only a working supply line could keep the men fed faster than the countryside ran out. And that is exactly why the collapse, when it came for Rome, always came from the very same place. Cut the supply line, and the invincible legion turned out not to be invincible at all. Rome's own history is stitched through with the other side of this story. Armies trapped deep in hostile country, with the grain gone and the wagons taken. Generals watching their men weaken and drop not from wounds, but from empty stomachs and the sickness that follows hunger. Whole forces that surrendered or simply melted away because the food stopped arriving, and no fortress of discipline can hold a starving man in line forever. The same legion that could outlast anyone on earth with a full supply chain behind it starved exactly as fast as any warband once that chain was broken. There is no magic in any of it, and I do not want to sell you any. Rome was not unbeatable. It was better fed, And on the days when the feeding failed, the legend went hungry right along with everybody else. If you want that kind of self-reliance in your own hands, the plain ability to feed a person from raw grain and an open fire, the from scratch, no modern comfort skill that the Roman soldier lived by every single day of a campaign, that is the whole reason we gathered the collection together in the first place. And this is the last time I will bring it up. It pulls those old skills into one place so that they do not quietly disappear, the way so much of this knowledge already has. The link is down in the description. So let me hand the story back to you the right way, because there is a reframe buried in it, worth carrying out the door with you. There was never anything unglamorous about the grain. We are trained, almost from childhood, to think that the interesting part of Rome is the fighting, and the boring part is the supply. And it turns out to be exactly backwards. The mill on a man's back, the biscuit baked twice so that it would keep for the road, the paved highway laid down to carry a harvest to the frontier, the fort dug fresh around the food every single night. That machinery was the genius of Rome, and that machinery was the empire. The thing that conquered the known world was never a single weapon in a single hand. It was a kind of knowing how to move food and men across a continent together and keep them fed long enough to win. That is the part the marble always leaves out. And it is the part that is actually worth remembering, because every empire that came after and forgot it went on to learn the very same lesson the very hard way, standing in some field with an army it could no longer feed. The sword got the statues, but the mill and the road and the grain fleet are what actually won the wars. So now I genuinely want to hear from you. Tell me which one of these surprised you more. That a Roman soldier hauled his own grinding mill and baked his own bread at the end of a 20-mile march. Or that Rome's single deadliest weapon turned out, in the end, to be a supply line. Drop it in the comments and I will read them. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, go straight to the next one, where we follow exactly what happened to a Roman army on the day the supply line got cut. One of the great starvation campaigns. The day the machine broke and the legend found out what it was like to go hungry with everyone else.